My name is Bruce Jones. I'm the Vice President and the Director of Foreign Policy here at Brookings, and it's a really sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's event, the launch of this book, All Measures Short of War, by my friend and colleague, Tom Wright. Tom is the newly appointed director of our Center on the United States and Europe, having very ably directed our project on international order and strategy, to which he still actively contributes. I first met Tom at a conference on international order at Princeton, in which he and I disagreed, but very agreeably, on China's role in the evolving order. He was right, I was wrong. So I did the only sensible thing, which is I offered him a job. And fortunately, he accepted and has been here since and has flourished as one of the leading voices on the new geopolitics and great power competition as it's evolving in the contemporary landscape. And I can't help but interject that last week, in recognition of his substantial accomplishments since he's been here, all of the vice presidents of Brookings met and unanimously and enthusiastically promoted him to senior fellow. And I think that's just one sort of tribute to the quality of work that Tom has been doing. And now he's written what I think is going to be an essential book, one that will stand as the first major account of the new geopolitics. As his first chapter lays out, the return of this competition, geopolitical competition, is kind of sweeping away some of the assumptions that we've carried with us since the first phase of the post-Cold War era and the kind of first blush of post-G20 enthusiasm. A rising China is shifting the dynamics in the Asian Pacific, and a liberal and populist wave in Europe, together with an expansionist Russia, is challenging the European project. We've seen the collapse of order in the Middle East that continues to undermine the peace and prosperity in the region, as well as having enormous human costs and spilling over beyond its borders. And Tom's book looks at each of these troubling trends against the backdrop, and this is for me the really critical part, against the backdrop of an increasingly globalized economic world, and begins to lay out, I think for the first time, what geopolitical competition, including militarized geopolitical competition, is going to look like in a context of continuing economic integration and globalization. And he'll expand on that, looking at how it is that globalization is shaping how the great powers will compete, placing a premium on tools like cyber warfare, economic warfare, coercive diplomacy, and other measures short of war, hence the title of the book. I think it's going to be a must-read for those interested in the future of American grand strategy, and it's certainly at the forefront of our work here on the new geopolitics. So we'll look forward to hearing from Tom, and after that, Susan Glazer from Politico, thank you, Susan, for doing this, is going to chair a panel where we'll have a discussion about the themes, and our own Bob Kagan and Ambassador Jarrah, thank you for coming back. We'll join Susan on stage to grill Tom about his findings. So, Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Bruce, for that very kind introduction. I don't remember winning that argument, actually, back in Princeton many years ago, but thanks for revising history in my favor. And thank you to Susan and to the ambassador and to Bob for joining us on the panel today, and to all of you for coming. I'm not the first person to predict the end of the post-Cold War order or the post-war order. Some people thought it would end with a bang, others with a whimper. I don't know of anyone who thought it would end with a tweet, but that's probably where we are today. But I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, just about 10 minutes or so, just about the book, and then we'll get to the discussion. Because really, what I argue in the book is that we've come to sort of the end of a 20-year period after the Cold War, which was sort of an age of convergence, in which the assumption was that all of the major powers in the world essentially saw things the same way, or on the same trajectory toward the single model of liberal international order. This wasn't sort of the end of history idea that Francis Fukuyama put forward. It was really, recognized that some countries wouldn't be democratic. They'd remain authoritarian. There'd be different stages in history, but that they would all sort of see the things they had in common as more important than the things that divided them, that they'd have common challenges like climate change, pandemic disease, terrorism, managing the global economy, that they would cooperate in pursuit of realizing their interests and objectives on those particular problems, and that they wouldn't really balance against each other, what political scientists sort of call balancing, where one country will organize to stymie or prevent another from achieving its objectives. objectives. And this 20-year period was really unique because we had the absence of geopolitical competition for the first time really since the Peace of Westphalia. There were plenty of moments where the major powers had problems and crises, but those problems and crises were always quite limited. So when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, Russia and many other countries objected. But Russia didn't send troops to aid Saddam Hussein. It didn't intervene in the Iraq war militarily. It confined itself to diplomatic disagreements, quite a stark contrast with today in Syria, where when Russia disagreed with what the United States was doing and sent troops into Syria and backed Assad. So we're seeing, I think, the return of real geopolitical competition. And I think this has happened because some of the key pillars of international order since the Cold War have sort of fallen apart. The thing that was upholding convergence, I think, more than anything else, was the disparity in power between the United States and the other major powers, the sort of so-called era of unipolarity. It just didn't make a lot of sense for countries to balance against the US. Well, that gap has narrowed. There was also the notion that the international order was actually providing for people, that it was helping countries achieve their objectives. Globalization was a pathway to peace and prosperity. But after 2008 and 2009, that's a harder case to make. In the Middle East, both Bush and Obama, in very different ways, believed that that part of the world was progressing toward a more positive future. Bush believed it would happen through the use of force and a more assertive foreign policy. Obama believed it would happen through indigenous change and the power of example. But both of those assumptions really fell apart after the failure of the Arab awakening. And so I think starting with the financial crisis, but really through 2012 with the return of Putin and the arrival of Xi Jinping, we've really seen sort of a fundamental change. And the question is, I think, what follows next? What sort of is going to be our next sort of 10 or 20 years as we see China and Russia that are, I think, rebelling against the international order in their respective regions. As we see a Middle East that's essentially in free fall or unraveling, a global economy that isn't working, that appears to be more crisis prone, and the return of competition across all spheres, really, ideological competition between democracies and authoritarian regimes, military competition, diplomatic competition. So what is this sort of different world? So I want to just make 5 very brief points about what type of world I think we're headed into. As we look at the different choices that people make and leaders make and governments make, we can get down into the sort of details about each policy choice. But I think overall foreign policy is actually about choosing between 2 different types of worlds, because there are 2 different models of international order that's on offer. The first is some sort of version of the order that we had in the past, some version of the liberal international order. It may be a little bit different than what we had before. India may play a greater role, other democracies may play a greater role, but it will inherently be recognizable to us. It will be open, there'll be an open global economy that promotes trade, it will be broadly stable geopolitically, borders will pretty much remain intact, there will continue to be international norms and international institutions. That's sort of the familiar order, I think, that we could have over the next couple of decades. But the second is a spheres of influence model, that tends to be more nationalist, more mercantilist. Russia plays a much greater role in Eastern Europe and is sort of the preeminent power in its near abroad because it's established a greater sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union and maybe even further afield. In East Asia, China shares power with the United States and has control really of the western part of the Western Pacific, and the region begins to organize more around the Chinese economy rather than on a relationship with the United States. That these 2 different worlds, I think, are very fundamentally different, and they have very different dynamics. Russia and China, I think, are proactively trying to establish a spheres of influence order in very different ways, but I think the objective is similar. In Eastern Europe, Russia is a declining power in many ways, but it has increased increasingly deployable military power, and it's using its hard power and its increased will to try to change borders, as we saw in Ukraine, potentially elsewhere. And it wants to, I think, fundamentally weaken the EU and NATO because it sees them as a threat, not militarily. You know, the military threat in Europe has actually declined considerably for Russia, but it fears color revolutions. It sees the liberal order as essentially promoting regime change in Russia through the power of example, and that's something that it cannot tolerate. And so it's interacting with these other existing crises in Europe, and I named 4 others in the book: the Euro crisis, the refugee crisis, the Trump crisis, I think, in transatlantic relations, and Brexit, all of which are coming together to create this negative synergy in that part of the world that plays into Putin's hands. So that's what Russia, I think, is up to in Europe. And then in China, you have a very different story. China's the rising power. It has a stake in the global economy. It wants to see a strong international economic order, in some ways a strong international political order, but in its region, it has considerable ambition, and it wants to push that US alliance system to the margins and replace it with something else, something in which it has more of a tributary system in line with its past. So I think that's what the sort of choice are, that's what the dynamics are. It is a regional competition at its heart. And some people say, you know, that means that it's not such a big deal because it's really all about the global. So if China wants a strong global order but wants changes in its region, surely that doesn't matter too much. But one of the cases I make in the book is that actually that's really, we should be really concerned about that, because ultimately the global order rests on healthy regional orders more than it rests on the UN or the IMF and the World Bank. It's much more important as those institutions are, it's much more important what countries do about borders and respect for the sovereignty of other nations in their near abroad than it does whether or not they fight over voting weights at the IMF or other institutions. And so when we look in the past about how orders unravel, they always unravel regionally first and then globally. So I think the challenge we face is pretty significant. The second point is that as countries sort of go about this competition, including the US, I think, they don't want to fight each other. You know, they don't want to fight a general war with each other. Russia doesn't intend to fight the United States directly, and China doesn't either. And the United States, I think, has no interest in doing the same to either of those nations. But they are, I think, competing, and this is where the title of the book comes from, with all measures short of war, that they're using cyber war and economic war and coercive diplomacy and lots of other different types of tools and methods to try to promote their interests. And they're trying to go right up to that threshold of major conflict, or maybe a little bit short of it, to achieve their objectives. As they do this, they're using this 20-year period of integration where we all became closer, we all integrated our financial systems, our communication systems. They're seeing that as providing vulnerabilities and strategic opportunities. And so they're pushing the envelope to try to exploit that. And the country that arguably, you know, pioneered this really was the United States. I mean, the US, when faced with the threat from Russia in Eastern Europe, used Russia's reliance on the global economy and the international financial system as a weapon to try to punish Russia for its strategic actions. Those countries, Russia, but also China, I think, have been trying to hedge against that by deglobalizing on the Russian side in particular from the global economy to protect their autonomy and protect their sovereignty. They have responded also, though, in kind on the cyber front, where the US is very reliant on these shared systems and is very vulnerable itself. And so the actions that Russia took last year, I think, were no accident. They were really part of this ongoing geopolitical competition where Russia tried to exploit Western vulnerability in the same way that the West tried to exploit Russian vulnerability on the global order. This competition will play out in many different ways, and we can talk, I'm sure, in the panel about the South China Sea or Ukraine. But one thing I think we need to keep in mind as we look at international cooperation or climate or anything else is that it makes everything more difficult. I'm not saying that this is the only thing that's happening in the world. There are many things that are happening: climate, counterterrorism, nuclear proliferation, but the context for it, I think, is becoming much less permissive. Because when you have geopolitical competition between major powers, it makes all types of cooperation more difficult. One very simple example in the book is that when the first Malaysian airline went missing, that the countries in the region couldn't share their data and couldn't share the information that they had because they worried that it would be exploited by other countries for strategic reasons in the future. And that's a very simple case where all countries basically shared the same objective. But that's likely to play out, I think, on the proliferation side, on the counterterrorism side, on the global economy side, very differently in the future. Imagine a financial crisis in Asia where you required cooperation between the United States and China and Japan. Would they all be focused on the same objective of stopping the crisis, or would they be looking for their own advantage? And the final point is just on what this means for the US. I try to spend a lot of time in the book on the strategic choice that the US has. And I think we do need to sort of look at the actual options and strategies that are available. This is often framed in a financial way, that there should be more money spent in defense, or Europeans should pay more, or Asian countries should do more. But actually, I think that it's really a strategic problem, not a resource problem. Things may be made easier if we 10% or 20% more resources, but it wouldn't solve the strategic dilemmas in the Middle East. It wouldn't solve the strategic dilemmas in Asia or in Europe. Those would all remain intact. And so I think we do need to look at that. I identified three sort of strategic problems that I think the United States needs to deal with, that any strategy has to deal with. That's the return of revisionist powers, particularly in Russia and China, but potentially elsewhere too. The unraveling of the Middle East, where the dilemma is, do you sort of engage to stop the contagion at the risk of being dragged into future conflicts there, or do you pull back, and what the trade-off is between those two. And the third is how to build liberal order in an increasingly nationalist and populist world where there's less domestic support to promote a healthy global economy or to promote international cooperation. So I distinguish between two sort of broad types of strategies in the book. One is sort of a strategy of restraint, or sort of pulling back in some way, trying to define America's interests in more normal terms, like a normal power, looking at sort of narrow interests in terms of territorial defense or surrounding oceans or trade routes, looking very specifically what are America's specific interests in the Middle East. And I think in very, very, very different ways, both Presidents Trump and Obama fall into that category of trying to figure out a way to limit America's exposure to the international order. I think that in the long run, those types of strategies select for accommodating a series of influence order, that they tend to pull back from the proactive role that the US has had in promoting regional equilibriums in the key regions strategically of the world. The second strategy, which I make a case for in the book, is something I call responsible competition, which is how to compete to try to preserve this liberal international order, maybe reformed and renovated in certain ways in the 21st century. And I'll just mention a couple of the things that I propose in closing. The first is to really accept that we are in a more competitive age. But to do so in a responsible way, to promote not sort of narrow national interests, but a certain type of broader sense of the national interests about an order that would work to the benefit of all nations. Because I think one key strategic asset that the United States has had is that the way the US has defined its interests tends to be more compatible with how most countries in the world define their interests compared to hegemons or leaders of the past. Not always perfectly, and there's plenty of hypocrisy and inconsistency, but I think it does sort of trend in that direction. So recognizing the competitive nature, I think, of the international order, and that as more important possibly than some of the things that we looked at in the past, like convergence, is, I think, key to having a successful national security strategy. The second thing is, as we look at the competition between Russia and China, not to sort of focus on tit-for-tat retaliation. China's built this island. How do you sort of impose costs for building that island? Or Russia has a certain part of eastern Ukraine. But to think of it more holistically about how do you deny the overall strategic objective of countries that have revisionist aims. So maybe China builds certain islands in the South China Sea, but there are things that can be done to ensure that the South China Sea remains open to commerce and is not controlled essentially by China, even if they have engaged in those activities. The third thing is to have a little bit of a different attitude, I think, on burden sharing. I think this is overdone by President Obama and by President Trump. The emphasis, I think, is understandable on the 2% number in Europe, but I think it's overly simplistic and really ignores the role that these countries play in upholding the international order. And the final thing really is to look at how to preserve the liberal nature of, and I mean that in the classical sort of sense rather than in the partisan sense, of the international order, because of the way in which I think that can help solve some of the common problems over the long run, and to preserve cooperation with Russia and China in areas of common interest, even as there is an overall competition. So I hope that that's a fruitful way to start our conversation. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you very much.